네, 안녕하십니까. 그럼 오늘
Hello everyone. We will start day 2 of the international conference for the 30th anniversary of KIF. We are going to have 90 minutes of panel discussion. Professor Young-Chul Park of Korea University will moderate over the panel.
누가 나와야 할 거 아니에요? 그 사람들. 사람이 안 보이는데 여기 아무것도 안 보여. 그 사람들하고 보고서 해야 할 거 아니겠어? 내가 상대가 그 사람들인데. 나왔어? 여기는 안 보여. Good morning. Can you hear us?
Good morning. Yes, I can.
Yeah, okay.
Indeed.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us for the panel discussion this morning. Yesterday, I sent you an email describing how I'm going to conduct the panel discussion, so that I'm not going to spend what I will do. What I'm going to do is I will ask Professor Lee, sitting right next to me, to give a summary discussion of the conference papers to start the discussion. Discussion. So I'll give him. I don't know how much time would you need, but why don't you start?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Park. And good morning and good evening in the US. Hello. So my job today is to discuss some issues raised by Daron Acemoglu and Mori Abstfeld yesterday, in particular from the perspectives of the Korean economy. This semester I'm teaching a graduate level advanced macroeconomics at Korea University, focusing on economic growth and open economic macroeconomics using 2 textbooks. One is Modern Economic Growth by famous author Daron Acemoglu, and the other is Foundations of International Macroeconomics, authored by Mori Abstfeld, my former teacher at Harvard when he visited Harvard University. So I'm very honored to be here today for panel discussion with many prominent scholars who have shaped the field of economics. I also admire the work on finance done by the Thorsten Beck. So, well, I enjoyed their presentations very much yesterday, though very remotely, regrettably. So I may not need to summarize the main points of the presentations, but considering that many people may have forgotten what they have said, emphasized overnight, over the sleep. So let me just reiterate a few points. So I have prepared some slides for your convenience. So can you please upload my PowerPoint slide? There are a few slides. But yes, thank you. So I'm just summarizing a few points. Of course, there are many other important takeaways we should get from their presentations. So Daron emphasized 5 major existential challenges to the global economy, including increase in inequality, rapid aging, climate change, retreat of democracy, and collapse of global order. And he emphasized we need a new institutional framework centered on regulation of technology and different responsibilities from firms. And this new international framework needs to be based on the 4 pillars: welfare state 3.0, democracy, broader vision of the responsibilities and objectives of corporations, and global coordination. And Mori Abstfeld explained, currently the global economy is on expansionary stage of the global financial cycle, but it may turn around when the major central banks, including Fed, start to tighten. So emerging market and developing economies, EMDs, will be very vulnerable to an uneven global rebound. So he said, we need to enhance the financial system's resilience by strengthening regulation of non-bank financial institutions, the global financial safety net, GFSN, capital flow measures, and exchange rate flexibilities. So I believe these presentations provide a very nice overview and assessment of the global economy during and after COVID-19. So, but however, I would like to raise the 5 issues just for further clarification and discussion from the perspectives of emerging market and developing economies and Korea. So first issue is the Daron emphasized that automation is a major factor that have deteriorated income distribution in the US as well as in other countries. So I believe automation or labor-saving technologies have had a nice negative effect on wage equality, yes. But however, a question remains regarding to what extent automation have exactly contributed to income inequality and will do so in emerging economies. So this is the basically lead to the practical policy questions, what we should do to improve income distribution. So second, Daron has rightly pointed out that we should build stronger democratic institutions and a new institutional framework to solve the major challenges in the global economy, yes. But I want to ask him the one question, whether and how we can strengthen democracy. Let me focus on in this region. I know that he explained a lot the situation in the US, where in this region, including South Korea, where people's demand for populism or authoritarianism is prevailing. So this is the one issue. Third, I also want to point out another real existential challenge to this region, which is the escalation of US-China conflicts. So I hope Daron and Mori can share their insight on how these US-China tensions can be relaxed, any ideas and any perspectives. So fourth, this is for Mori, and he discussed about fiscal vulnerabilities for EMDs. He pointed out EMDs fiscal responses to the COVID-19 crisis have made them more vulnerable to the US interest rate hikes that could set off the contractionary phase of the global financial cycle. In particular, I want to ask his view on the midterm fiscal sustainability and the risk of fiscal debt crisis in EMDs, particularly in Korea. Lastly and fifthly, Mori suggested several agendas to strengthen global financial system. So one issue is how to assess the future role of dollar and digital currencies. So these issues, I want to just elaborate a little bit, and then I'll stop my discussion. There are many other important issues related to the financial markets and global finance. I understand that the other panelists will focus on the real financial issues. So I will just focus on the more macro and the global issues. So the question is on the income inequality. This is the really important agenda for every country at this moment. So automation or technological development must be an important factor for income inequality. So Daron provided very compelling evidence from the United States data. But despite the acceleration of automation, existing data shows that we have not observed deterioration of income distribution in a recent decade. As you can see, the left side panel data, income distribution measures are basically the more stable between 2007 and 2019, which I assume that the automation has been accelerated. So especially in the emerging economies, other factors such as education, skill formation, and the trade seem to play more important roles for income distribution. I want to just introduce one study I have done. The right side panel presents how income wage inequality indices and college wage premium have changed in Korea since 1980. This is not just by me. Many people used the similar data and found the similar result. The wage inequality declined significantly between 1980 until the 1994, and then the trend reversed. Inequality has increased, like many other countries, until its peak in 2000 and 2008. And then since then, there are gradual decline of wage inequality since then. So what was the cause of this change of the income wage inequality? So my study just cited in the source here is I did some framework, actually developed by Daron Acemoglu in his handbook chapter. So the movement in the college wage premium are mainly explained by as many people here imagine, the expansion of the relative supply of the college graduate and an increase in the relative demand for high-skilled labor due to the expansion of trade with China. So this issue will lead to the policy questions. So how we should improve the income inequality. So regulating the automation or big technology may not be the only or the major solution to solve this problem. That's what I'm trying to say. Second issue is yes, we need to build a stronger democratic institutions. But many populist regimes, including Latin American countries, which is more well known in Korea, in the 1970s, 80s, rely on the expansionary fiscal and monetary policy and trade protection and heavy intervention in market. And today's populists also rely on the same set of the policies. So populism is also rising in Asia. Here are some data here. Recent surveys show that in many East Asian countries, including South Korea, levels of anti-establishment sentiment and frustration with economic inequality are very high, providing environment that populism can flourish. So this is from the Asia Barometer survey. Korea's people are quite very high dissatisfaction with income inequality and the existing political parties. And then the very recent survey from the Pew Research Center in the right-hand side, many European countries is also similar, but Korea is very unique among the Asian countries. They are very unsatisfied with current political and economic institutions. So this issue is well, of course, I mean, the people may say the populists can care about the people, but the question is what would be the long-term consequences of the populism? This has been emphasized by many people, including Daron Acemoglu, that it will hurt the long-term economic development and also weaken, in many cases, in practice, the established institutions of representative democracies. So, Daron Acemoglu emphasized that in the current situation, especially in the United States, regulating big tech companies may be the important part of the solution to promote the democracy. I tend to agree, but in my view here is if you want to really improve the democratic institutions, we need to avoid the populism or alternatively, authoritarianism, this is China is pursuing. So, but the question is the how. I mean, I have no idea. But I have some ideas, but I better to ask the real expert on this. So, this question is I was just trying to bring, because I have no solution. So, the escalation of the United States and China conflict, this is the really most existential challenge for this region. Nowadays, I mean, even in tension in the surrounding the Taiwan is also a big issue. We care about. This will have a big implication from the U.S. perspective to control China's rise to global hegemonic power. But at the same time, this trade and technology war, if escalated between two largest economies, will hurt Asia as well as the global economy. So this impact will be the largest for South Korea. According to the estimation by the IMF, Korea case, Korea's the 18% of the total value added rely on the directly and indirectly export to the US and China. So this is the very huge number. So because South Korea is open to the international trade and finance, and also heavily dependent on the US and Chinese markets, if this conflict is escalated, this will be the very significant implications. So how can the world avoid the escalation of the US-China conflict? Because from my perspective, this is the bilateral conflict is always unfortunate. We need some other third party who can mediate between two parties' confrontations. But currently, the global institutions are very weak. I mean, so this is very unfortunate. And so, question is how we see the future development of this conflict, and then how. The real question is how should Korea prepare for it? This is another question. And it's the fiscal debt crisis issue. Because the presentation which I look at from the Mori Abstfeld presentation is he pointed out this COVID-19 response is putting a severe strain on the government fiscal position. So in many emerging economies in Asia, or even the advanced economies, but advanced economies have a key international currency, so maybe the implications may be low compared to the emerging economies. So this right-hand side shows that the government overall deficit will continue. South Korea case is now we suffer fiscal deficit, and then will continue, and then you can see from right-hand side, the panel. This is the estimate by the estimate and projections by the National Assembly Budget Office. So it will increase very rapidly since 2022, and then it will reach 100%. The fiscal debt to GDP ratio will reach over 100% in 2040. So 2040 is not far away. So, well, I don't know what percent or what ceiling we should care about, but maybe 100% is too high, I guess. So it's very difficult for South Korea to resume high growth and normalize fiscal balance, because we still need the significant investment, infrastructure investment, to take care of the digitalization and environment, and also significant increase in the social expenditures, especially to care about the elderly. So, what is the current discussion among the global experts? I'm curious, because if one country like South Korea is very open to the global economy, and then fiscal deficit will continue to increase, and then fiscal debt will be accumulated over time, and then growth rate will decline significantly, at least due to the shrinking labor force. So how we can assess the possibility of the fiscal debt crisis in the future? So this, of course, will depend on the global financial cycle, the Mori emphasized, but I want to hear his further view on these issues. And my last slide is this global reserve system issues. This is the one fundamental issue to strengthen the global financial system. As we all know, the US dollar has been a dominating reserve currency. So dollar gives seniority and prestige to the United States. But there are always conflict of the US interest between the domestic monetary policy goals and other countries' demand for reserve currencies and also global spillovers. So sometimes it's called as a Triffin dilemma. I was surprised even the college entrance exams here. Actually, it was this Triffin dilemma was asked in the exams. So since the global financial crisis in 2007 and 2008, there have been discussion to how to promote an alternative international reserve currencies, such as SDR and even the renminbi from the perspective of China. Of course, this is very difficult to change the existing current, we sometimes call these externality issues. But nowadays, there are a lot of this debate on the role of the digital currencies, such as cryptocurrencies, stable coins, and central bank digital currencies on the global financial system. So nowadays, many major central banks are studying virtual form of their currencies. So People's Bank of China is now already testing out the eCNY, as you can see in this chart. So the question is, I wonder how much this type of the development centered on the digital currency, especially the central bank digital currency, will have an impact on the global financial system, especially global reserve system. So this is the end, and I want to thank Daron and Mori, and as well as the Torsten, for sharing their insightful papers yesterday. And I enjoyed their presentations again. I raised a few issues, but I appreciated your further insight. Thank you for your attention. Let me stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. I will call on other participants to select some of the issues raised by other paper writers, including Chonghua, for you to comment. And then I'll call on you in alphabetical order. The first, Professor Asemoglu, followed by Professor Beck and Dr. Kim, and finally Professor Ostfeld. So Professor Asemoglu, would you make some comments on other papers and as well as the Chonghua's discussion this morning?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Park. There's a lot to talk about, and Dr. Zhonghua Li has raised many interesting problems, and I don't want to hog all the time, but I want to talk about a few things. First of all, I have not studied in detail inequality trends in Korea. I have seen them, but I have not looked into the different causal factors. But I think the Korean case is, of course, different because there is very rapid educational upgrading, very rapid changes in the composition of trade, demographic changes, and also obviously very rapid robot adoption or other automation technologies. I think all of these are playing a role. The other factor that I'm looking into at the moment, but don't have anything to report on, is of course changes in labor market institutions in Korea, which I think is also a very interesting case from the military period where there was a lot of labor repression. Labor organization and collective bargaining have changed a lot. It's actually one country that goes in the opposite direction to many other industrialized nations in terms of labor representation increasing. So I think all of those make it very interesting. But I don't have anything concrete to say. In terms of democracy, however, I think, you know, for any country at the moment, democracy is a very challenging process. Globalization and nationalism are two wild cards that have changed political dynamics. Both political scientists and economists, I think, have underestimated both the effects of globalization on domestic politics, and also we have sort of ignored how stubborn and resurgent nationalism would be. And in some sense, one thing that's common across very different countries, Turkey under Erdogan, the Philippines under Duterte, or Brazil under Bolsonaro, or India under Narendra Modi, is there's a lot of nationalism that is being leveraged by these leaders in their populist, authoritarian, whatever you're going to call their particular brand of anti-democratic politics. And in that respect, I actually see Korea as relatively successful, because this line has been avoided, and it's a very participatory process. It's again, the data I have seen suggests there's much greater engagement of civil society in politics in Korea, and the fact that there is a growing budget deficit may not be so surprising, in the sense that if my observations are relevant, which they may not be, I think growing demands on state institutions are going to be a constant across many nations, and I think many other countries, if especially their democracy is functioning, are going to see pressure for greater spending. And then the question is, how much of that is going to be in terms of deficits, how much of that is going to be immediate tax increases? I think if the US had more functional politics right now, we would see greater expenditure in the US as well. So in some sense, I don't see the growth of spending as necessarily a failure of democracy in Korea, but obviously Dr. Lee is absolutely right that it does raise a lot of questions about how to encourage economic growth in the age of higher taxes or higher budget deficits. And I think US-China conflict is very important. Actually, I have a lot to say about that, but I don't want to take too much time, so perhaps I can come back to the issue of US-China conflict, because I think it is obviously a major issue for South Korea especially. And I'm not entirely sure that the current sort of vogue in international relations circles or political scientists to describe this as a new Cold War is particularly productive, but I'm certainly open to hearing the South Korean perspective on this. But I want to make one comment or question for Maury and also for Thorsten, which, rather than commenting on their paper, which I think they were both excellent, but I want to sort of bring it to a point of unity or intersection between our presentations. I think what we have seen over the last 2 decades is sort of developing countries struggling with democracy, often reversing democracy, in the age of cheap money. And this, I think, has been both a blessing and a curse. It's been a blessing in the sense that they had a lot of resources, even when there were institutional problems, but it's also been a curse because I think many of these regimes have been able to get away with lots of irregular behavior, both at the macroeconomic level, at the institutional level, and I agree exactly with Maury that we are at a different stage of this, if you're going to call it the global cycle. So the interest rates are going to increase in the future, and that's going to make emerging markets less attractive for global investors. And I think a very important point for both technology but also politics will be how emerging markets react to higher interest rates. My guess is that this is going to be a rude awakening for many of them, but some of them might actually weather the storm. My guess, again, and I would love to hear more from Maury and Torsten, and as well as Jong-Hwa Lee, is actually South Korea is in a fairly good position, because what distinguishes South Korea is that it's got much stronger democratic institutions, much better rule of law than India, Turkey, South Africa, the Philippines, Brazil, much of Latin America. So I think even though there is a budget deficit here, when interest rates increase, international interest rates increase, this might not be as big of a shock to South Korea as it will be, say, for Turkey or for Brazil. But I would love to hear more and understand also this broader implications. Thank you.
Well, would you respond to comments by your discussant yesterday? I don't think you had enough time to respond to. He was rather critical about some of your propositions, and we would very much like to hear about your.
Well, I think I gave a very brief answer, but it was too brief. But let me sort of expand on that. I think the disagreement was may have been in whether regulation would work, what the political economy of regulation would be, and the role of sort of global versus domestic politics. And I don't have any way of disproving the concerns that Suresh Naidu increased. So to repeat, one would be the regulatory capacity is not there, or the regulatory will is not there, even if we agree that we have a problem at the moment. A second would be, the democratic process wouldn't support regulation. And then the third would be to deal with global problems. We need sort of global civil society and global sort of solutions, including international migration. My take is very different. First of all, I think absolutely the regulatory capacity in the US has been decimated, but that's endogenous. It's been decimated because we have destroyed what we expect from the state and the civil services ethos. And the only way of rebuilding that is actually increasing the demand from the state. When civil service is playing a useful role, antitrust authorities are dealing with antitrust issues, NSF and NIH are at the forefront of scientific research. I think it will attract better people. It will attract more of a dedicated cadre, and with the support that comes from both civil society and the political process, if that can be made to work, it would gradually, in fact, quite rapidly build state capacity. So if you look at the US, during historical periods, it has sometimes developed state capacity very quickly. Now, of course, that brings the question, would the political economy of that work? And yes, absolutely not at the moment. There is too much polarization. There's too little ability between the right and the left to work in the US. So that needs to be some sort of political transition. But I think that political transition will have to involve some sort of consensus that some of these challenges are severe enough, such as climate change, such as inequality. And again, we're seeing that, that we're definitely not seeing any evidence of that taking place in the US, but we're seeing some of that in the European right, that European right is struggling with some of these issues. And I think there will be a big transformation of center-right parties in Europe, especially in Germany, for example, but also in the UK, in the Netherlands. And then finally, unfortunately, I wish Suresh was right, or that global civil society or global institutions could be built like that. Unfortunately, I think politics is local and will continue to be local, and the only way of building global cooperation is actually starting from the domestic politics. And I hope I'm wrong on that, and that there is a way of building global democracy with strong global institutions that would obviously be much better. I just don't think it's feasible. But so I'm saying, I'm not entirely pessimistic, because I think domestic politics can turn around, but I'm not optimistic enough to think that we're going to have some sort of global democracy anytime soon.
Okay, thank you very much. Thorsten, your turn.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, good, wonderful, thank you. So yes, well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to also be part of this panel today, this morning or this evening, however you want to look at it. I did actually watch the presentations, the remaining presentations from yesterday. So, and I want to follow up on a couple of points, but then also kind of refer back to some of the very valid points made by Professor Lee and by Professor Acemoglu. So the first thing Professor Obstfeld mentioned yesterday, international cooperation being somewhat more advanced now than it was, for example, in 2008. And I would say yes and no. So, and I'm talking specifically about the financial sector. I mean, the structures that we have in place now, and you were referring to the Basel III, for example, we can go beyond that, and specifically like crisis management groups, supervisory colleges. I mean, a lot has happened in terms of cooperation across countries in preparing for crisis situation, be it on the bank level, be it on more systemic level. And again, we also seen this certain coordination, the swap lines, for example, which were also put in place relatively quickly. But of course, there are also threats against this. And I'm going to talk several times in the next couple of minutes about Brexit, so I just can't avoid it. I spent the last couple of years in London. But Brexit, of course, is, especially when it comes to financial sector cooperation, is going to be a bit of a elephant in the room, because there is a bit of a standstill right now between the European Union and the UK. Any common sense would tell us that there should be very close cooperation with the EU benefiting basically from the financial place, financial center London, even though it's outside, but the politics just tell us no. And I think that's going to be a kind of a sore point, or kind of a pawn basically in the negotiations between the EU and the UK. And that's, I mean, one can look at this for different sides. One can see, well, I mean, if the role of the financial center in London is decreased, this has efficiency losses. But then, as I also mentioned yesterday, I mean, maybe the financial sector has grown too big for its own benefit and for the benefit of the society that it's supposed to support. So maybe a somewhat higher transaction cost, some more sand in the wheels, and some reductions of the importance of the financial center in London can be beneficial, maybe not just for the UK actually, for internal distribution, but maybe also for the rest of the world. So so I'm a bit double-minded here. The other thing, I mean, I think Maury, you also mentioned the banking union, the single supervisory mechanism, single resolution mechanism. On the supervisory side, I would say yes, a lot has happened. I mean, they are really, I would argue, that they are building a common supervisory culture in the euro area and the banking union now, because it's euro area +2. On the single resolution mechanism, I think there's more on paper than in reality. I mean, we simply haven't had the failure of a major cross-border bank in Europe yet. So there's lots to do. But whenever we discuss this here in Europe, I always like to point to the US. I mean, in the US, it took 200 years to get to a banking union, basically. And I think in between, I keep forgetting the numbers, eight or 12 systemic banking crises. I thought it was 12, but maybe it's only 8. So I think it's going to be a long process. I think another very interesting point that Professor Obstfeld raised yesterday is, of course, the fiscal sustainability. And one maybe additional point also to bring this back, and you might have mentioned it or not, but to kind of bring this back to the other discussion on China is, of course, in many emerging markets, especially also in Africa, the role of China as a creditor has become increasingly important, unfortunately not necessarily in a very transparent way. And so that's going to be, I think, an issue going forward. Now, we have a bit of a similar issue, of course, in Europe. Maybe to focus briefly for 1 minute on that. If possible, I mean, so that there are two kind of scenarios, two extreme scenarios that can one envision going forward, like a virtuous cycle, continuing the virtuous cycle that we started basically at the onset of the crisis in 2020, where basically monetary and prudential authorities threw everything at the problem as much as they could, and ultimately then also the European Union followed up with this what we economists we were calling for Corona bonds. They didn't call it Corona bonds, but a kind of a restructuring or a reconstruction plan, or next generation EU. And I think this kind of push towards I would say a first step into a fiscal union, I think, has been very positive and ultimately has helped also. It has the potential to help in the recovery process, and continuing that, of course, can be kind of lead to a virtuous cycle. The opposite could lead to a vicious cycle. So the idea that some people, especially the new finance minister in Germany, raised to kind of go back to the fiscal rules of the so-called Maastricht criteria, would of course turn the fiscal stance in Germany, then potentially also in the rest of the euro area or the European Union, towards a very contractionary, tightening stance. And that, of course, could lead to all kind of problems that we've seen 10 years ago during the euro debt crisis. So there is a bit of a, and of course, again, it could also affect the banking system. I mean, I kind of laid out some channels yesterday, but it's a scenario that I would not like to wish, but which is kind of, it's of course clearly a political decision. Of course, also now the pressure, and here the political pressure comes up with higher inflation, and the big question, is this transitory or is there more a structural element to it? What will the ECB do? And the problem of potential fiscal dominance, of not being able to raise interest rate because this could undermine debt sustainability of some of the member countries of the euro area, that of course might come up. But I would love to hear also Maurice's view on that. Okay. Now, on the fascinating paper, fascinating discussion presentation yesterday by Professor Acemoglu, and when I read the paper and when I listened to the presentation, so what came to my mind is this interesting book by Martin Sanpu, a Financial Times journalist, called The Economics of Belonging. And Martin, of course, doesn't claim any originality to the ideas that he kind of puts forward in his book, but he kind of focuses on the policy. And basically, it's very similar to what you called the welfare state 3.0. Some can also call it like a new manifesto for the social democratic movement, kind of the center left movement that until like 2 months ago was supposed to be in crisis in Europe, and now suddenly it's not in crisis anymore with the new German chancellor, but we'll see about that. But I guess just a couple of additional ideas. So yes, automation, globalization, maybe technical progress has led to a kind of undermining of this workforce in manufacturing, but it doesn't really have to be always like in the US, where basically these people lose their job and then just end up in very cheap McDonald's shops, fast food restaurants. So there's an interesting study for Denmark, for example, which showed that there has been a shift actually sometimes the same companies from manufacturing into services, where basically only the production part is being outsourced to somewhere else, but the services part is still being maintained. And ultimately the workers, even the ones that lose their job and then have to go somewhere else, they're actually not necessarily worse off. And of course, this has, of course, you can say, well, Scandinavia is a different, almost a different planet, what many people say. But I think there are some policies that can be kind of glimpsed at or glanced from this experiment. So flexicurity is, for example, is one of these buzzwords that's being used at basically flexible labor markets, but also with this very tight social safety net, which of course brings me to the question for you, Darren, what about universal basic income? Is that something we ultimately have to move to? Fourth point I want to make, so now, yes, now I'm going to come to the politics. And actually, the first thing I want to say, so I saw this yesterday on the slide, but then Professor Naidu didn't really talk much about it, kind of seeing the EU as a negative example. So I kind of disagree with that, actually. I think the EU has been, I mean, I've been very much a critic of the whole euro debt, how the euro debt crisis was addressed. So I'm not a kind of a defender of of EU for at any price or EU policies. But I think the EU, I mean, if you look at the bigger picture, has been an incredibly successful experiment. I mean, there hasn't been any military conflict between EU members for the past, this is now 70 years, 80 years almost. For example, one specific policy, vaccines, which initially has been very much criticized, especially in the country where I used to live until 3 months ago in the UK, was very slow. But ultimately, I mean, with all the other problems with more on the demand side, vaccine hesitancy, there has been a certain equity in terms of vaccine distribution across the EU. And I think that itself is a huge success story. Now, I only wish we could do this also on the global level, but that's a bit, I guess, a bit beyond that, what we can expect. Now, on the populism polarization, yeah, so it's a very difficult topic. So maybe some remarks. So one is, I mean, there's a supply side and there's a demand side for populist policies. On demand side, so a very interesting study that I've seen for Europe is that it's not so much about the absolute change in income inequality, but it's the relative position. So if you are in, let's say, in the fourth quintile, and then suddenly you see the fifth quintile catching up, these are people that then tend to go more towards the right-wing party, and I think it's the ones in the third quintile who suddenly see the people in the fourth quintile moving up that maybe won't go more to the left-wing parties. So it's also it's much about the relative position in the income distribution than the relative income rather than the absolute income. That's what I want to say. So it is about income inequality. Yes, sorry, but it's the kind of the relative position. So not just about the Gini coefficient as such. Now, of course, there's also a supply factor here. Yeah? And I mean, I think Brexit is the best example. I mean, Brexit has been a relatively minor thought idea in the UK polity until 6 years ago. But it was driven by the Murdoch family, for example, and actually he was once asked why he hates the EU so much, and basically he said, well, when I call Downing Street 10, somebody, I get invited to dinner with the Prime Minister, if I call Brussels, nobody picks up the phone. So this kind of, and I mean, we've seen it with Brexit, actually, this becoming true. I mean, the UK over the last couple of years has really kind of deteriorated in terms of the degree of corruption and undermining of institutions. I mean, and ultimately undermining of democracy. That's a little bit similar to what Darren has described. I mean, some people call it the urbanization of the UK, and it's kind of a very sad story, which actually brings me to another point. I think that's what many observers of the US saying is, I mean, the UK, as you know, doesn't have a written constitution. A lot is based on norms, on kind of precedents, and that has been violated quite a lot. I think we've seen something similar also on the 6th of January and in the US. So that's a very difficult point. So maybe one last point I want to make. I was very kind of intrigued by what Darren just mentioned. The decline of democracy during periods of cheap money. And what will these leaders do when the interest rates go up? We know what the central bank of Erdogan will do, that we've seen already, that doesn't work very well. But I think maybe this is really about both the role of institutions and the role of leaders. So I mean, I know there's a study by, I think, of Bldg, who says, no, leaders don't matter. I kind of disagree with that. I think leaders can actually matter quite a lot. But it's also about institution. And kind of to bring it down on a very technical level, cheap money, credit booms, often consumer credit booms. We know from a literature, and I mentioned this yesterday briefly, that consumer credit booms can end up in recessions, can end up in big crises. I mean, so Atif Mian, Amir Sufi have also written about this. Well, one way that seems to work to kind of maintain that or kind of contain the problem with consumer credit booms is macroprudential policy. The question is, who is responsible for macroprudential policy? Is it purely political, or is the central bank? Then again, you can say, well, the central bank governor might not want to take away the punch bowl because you don't want to get under pressure, right? And we've seen the tendency towards that even like in 2016, 2019, 20 in the US with Powell and with Trump. So again, this is, I guess, a combination again of institutional constraints that populist leader would face, which, for example, again, the central bank of Erdogan have all gone through the window, right? There are no constraints anymore, but also norms, right? I mean, again, Donald Trump really violated a norm by directly criticizing the Federal Reserve, the head of the Federal Reserve. So again, I don't have any easy solution there, but I think that's something that we should certainly think more about. So let me stop here. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. I'm trying to finish the discussion around 10 o'clock, the Korea time, but we may have to go over the allocated time. If any participants may have to leave, please let me know. Well, I'm not a very good timekeeper, but Dr. Kim, your turn.
Let me use the podium.
All right.
Thank you. I'm Young-Do Kim from the Korea Institute of Finance. Today, I'm going to a little bit discuss about the presentation by Professor Beck and Park. Let me start my today's talk a little bit just by looking at the current economic situation in the world. As you all know, in the response of COVID-19 crisis, the governments around the world actually used various policies, including accommodative monetary and physical policy and expansion of financial supply, mostly through guarantees. In particular, developed countries actively use fiscal policy, which accounts for about 24% of GDP. As of Korea, addition to the expansion of physical expenditure is supplemented the physical expenditure by proposing financial policies such as building financial market stabilizer fund and guarantees in the size of 175 trillion won plus alpha. As a result, the stabilization of the financial market and financial system has been achieved greatly so far. By looking at the financial market as an indicator, it seems to have recovered rapidly from the initial shock of COVID-19 and has almost surpassed the previous level. However, as a liquidity increase as a result of accommodative policy, the asset market appears to be showing some signs of overheating. In particular, in the case of Korea, real estate price, especially apartment price, has risen to an extent which provokes concern about the housing price bubble. Although the base effect is reflected in the real economy. Growth rate of the major advanced countries are also showing a sign of recovery. However, the situation still remains uncertain since we are now seeing Omicron mutation of coronavirus. Given this, we cannot ignore the likelihood of other mutations and keep monitoring their impact on the real economy. In the meantime, I think it's necessary to find a role for future-oriented finance based on the achievement of financial stability after overcoming the current pandemic to some extent. Although the impact of COVID-19 has not completely disappeared yet, there are enough consensus on the attempt to realistically seeking coexistence with the virus. Now, in particular, as an internal or external change in the financial sector has progressed rapidly over the past few years, regardless of the impact of COVID-19, how to accept and respond to those changes has become an important fact in determining the mid to long-term development of existing financial sector. And now, this moment is judged to be a very important inflection point. Therefore, it can be said the presentation by Peck and Park expressed this aspect in very condensed way by sector. First of all, based on doubt about the effectiveness of long-standing accommodative monetary and monetary policy, I'm fully sympathetic to the criticism on current financial phenomena. First of all, Professor Bldg and Bach discussed the several major trends in the current financial finance. The first, the problem of increasing household debt due to the expansionary household-oriented loan. Second, the issue of the investment in intangible assets. The third, the development of non-bank financial institution, that is shadow finance. Finally, the emergence and development of fintech and big tech. By looking at them by one, first of all, household loan in Korea, mainly mortgage loan, are one of the main product of banking business at this moment in Korea. Household finance is already account for almost half of the bank loan. As a result, concern about the negative effect on household loan are growing as a market interest rate rise due to the recent base rate hike. In other words, it seems to be not only the Korean case that amplitude of the financial cycle from the household finance is getting bigger than in the past. In the case of Korea, in order to prevent the problem triggered by household debt, macro-prudential policies such as LTV and DSR regulation has been strengthened to allow loan to be made in the consideration of the borrower's repayment ability. However, it remains to see how much such a move will be effective when the size of a household loan is already huge and interest rate is rising. According to the analysis of the Korea Institute of Finance using macro data, when the interest rate rises by 1% point, almost 10% of borrowers from the bank has to bear the burden of interest increased repayment, which amount for more than 5% of their total income. In other words, the repayment burden is expected to be increased due to excessive debt and rising interest rate. This inevitably increases the possibility of household finance insolvency. Second, the international organizations such as the BIS mentioned that the existing financial system that provide credit with a tangible asset as a collateral may not sufficiently support the development of development of the technology industry. Since there is a concentration on the financial support for the existing industry with the land or building, there are possibilities that the financial system itself may not sufficiently support the development of new industry. In fact, as the first industrial revolution and data economies are emphasized in a future main industry, the center of gravity is highly likely to shift from the company holding tangible assets to companies holding intangible assets. Among these, if actual financial system does not properly evaluate the value of intangible assets, including intellectual property rights, it is highly likely that the financial system will act as a factor hindering the development of industry in the future. In other words, when the financial system can properly evaluate this change, it will be possible to build a virtuous cycle structure with a deepening and develops the financial sector and lead to future economic development. Third, there is a concern the economic function of existing financial system through banking may not be ineffective. If the supply of funds through the non-bank financial institutions, that is shadow finance. Since shadow finance is used in the way that bypass the credit supply channel through banks, there are possibility of exposing vulnerability in terms of maintaining or managing financial system. However, despite of voices of concern about the rapid growth of shadow finance, there is a few cases whether the realization of a crisis has been made visually at this moment. And finally, the flow of the financial innovation triggered by fintech is now evolving in the form of a big tech financial advancement into the financial sector, which can intrinsically undermine the competitiveness of the existing financial industry. And it is ultimately a problem that need to be considered for survival. However, various risks that are properly managed through the existing financial system can act as a channel to be realized, which is currently a big agenda in the Korean financial industry. In Korea, it seems that some big tech companies are actively seeking foray into the finance by bypassing the existing financial regulation system. However, in relation to the growth of big tech based on the network effect, there are rising interest in the fair authority to resolve monopoly, and the regulatory measures are being discussed. It is necessary to apply it in the line with the regulatory flow in other countries. From the point of view of this financial authority, it is necessary to determine the detail of regulation and supervision in accordance with the principle of identical regulation for identical act. Amid this trend, there is emerging new virtual asset, and issues related to virtual asset are difficult to personally answer. Although this presentation have talked about how virtual assets do not have a great value in reality, they are generate transaction and demand at the level that cannot be ignored. In fact, I know that many countries have already implemented or preparing various regulations to protect investors in the virtual asset market. Currently, regulation related to virtual assets around the world is mainly conducted in the accordance with the FATF guideline related to anti-money laundering. I'm not personally familiar with this topic and trend, but I expect that the appropriate regulation method will be created by a group of experts to protect investors or maintaining market order. Finally, I wanted to touch on the role of finance toward the carbon neutral economy. It is well recognized in Korea that the role of financial institute is very important to move toward the carbon neutral economy. And financial institutions are currently materializing it in the way by such a suspended loan to coal power plants. Companies, including financial institutions, are emphasizing the practice of ESG management, and recently they are in the process of quantifying a specific goal. In other words, the strength of the role of finance to move toward the carbon-free or carbon-neutral economy is an irreversible trend. However, rather than whether this process should be delivered by existing bank or should be market-oriented, I think it is a matter of both channels should go together. The presentation by Professor Peck and Park considerably present the concern about the present and future of financial industry. Of course, even though it is difficult for me to personally give an answer to this discussion, I would say it is a very meaningful as it reveals the author's point of view and provide a forum for the discussion. This is all I prepared. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Opsfeld, your turn.
Great. Well, first I have to say what a pleasure it is to see Jonghwa Lee here again. I remember distinctly the day you first walked into my office at Harvard when I was visiting with a paper on labor markets. And our conversation was pretty funny, but not really suitable for this audience. So if you don't remember it, we can take it up privately later. Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground in these comments, and it's impossible to respond to everything. So let me just respond to a few points that have been made, and then touch on the main topic that I am interested in exploring, which is international cooperation. And that will be very much related to Jonghwa's question about China. So, you know, on the Korean fiscal situation, over the next few years, Korea's general public debt to GDP ratio is projected to rise over 60%, you know, by mid-decade. Japan is at 260%. You know, I think the greater threat would be from a financial crisis that would force the government to take many private sector assets onto its books. And here, a number of authors, including in the paper yesterday afternoon, have mentioned the issue of consumer debt, which was certainly an issue before the COVID crisis, and I think going forward is even a bigger issue. The fiscal sustainability issue also arises in Europe, as Torsten pointed out. I do worry going forward about countries like Italy. We're putting a lot of faith in Mario Draghi being successful with his very laudable projects, deploying next generation EU funds in a way that raises infrastructure and productivity, which is also an issue for Korea, by the way. Achieving structural reforms, which have long eluded any government. So I think a lot of it is on the line, and we cannot rely on the ECB to provide exceptional accommodation forever. It's just not going to be politically feasible. So we have to pray for Mario, but also we have to pray for a more permanent fiscal union, one based on a complete banking union. As Torsten rightly pointed out, that the banking union is very incomplete at the moment. That creates vulnerabilities. Europe actually also needs a strong capital markets union to move forward. And the new German coalition has made, in the person of the incoming chancellor, has made positive noises. But the nature of that coalition raises questions about, will they really be able to deliver? Daron asked a fascinating question about cheap money and politics. And you know, I don't know the answer, but it's very interesting. If you look at the trajectory of emerging markets since the 90s, which was a decade of crises, there was a movement toward reform. In addition, the decade of the first decade of this millennium leading up to the global financial crisis was one of ample global liquidity, of booming commodity prices. It was particularly favorable for emerging markets, which in terms of their growth rates really broke decisively away from the group of advanced economies over that period. And if you looked at some of the pictures I showed yesterday, you can see that debt GDP ratios went down dramatically. And I believe that this very improvement in fiscal positions, coupled with continuation of low interest rates after the global financial crisis, and probably with some erosion in the trust in institutions after that crisis, also concerns about corruption in many countries, gave rise to more social demands. And the increases in public debt to GDP ratios, which we've seen in 2020 and since, began years before that. So in other words, there were increasing social demands, increasing social tensions. Chile is a great example of this, and it's astounding that after selecting a slate of very left-wing delegates to write a new constitution, Chile is facing the prospect of a far right-wing president who is nostalgic for General Pinochet. So, if someone can write me a model, that would be great. But I think any such model has to include probably distributional struggles, because all of these reforms gave rise to higher inequality and backlash of a populist or a nationalistic nature. But I couldn't tell you the model. Let me say a few words about international cooperation, and this has come up at various stages. I think most prominently in Daron's presentation, because to implement his idea of directing technology in a way that creates good jobs, it has to be an international project. Otherwise, you basically have to close down international trade. So where you go on that will depend on international cooperation. And it's not out of the question that countries could reach some sort of common view on what would be considered a, as it were, a sort of predatory evolution of technology, one that is exploitative of workers, and make trade accords on that basis. We're obviously far away from that, and our domestic politics don't allow that. But leaving aside that issue, there's a range of issues where cooperation is necessary. On disease, we've become all too aware of the magnitude of the problem, and it goes way beyond what we have equipped the WHO to do. And it really requires transfers of resources to emerging markets in large quantities to help them upgrade their health infrastructures, starting with the infrastructure for vaccinating people and getting their hands on vaccines. There's climate. I agree with Daron's sort of throwaway comment about the disappointment of COP26. This is not flashing red. It is a solid red red alarm now, and the global community failed to step up. There's financial regulation, which we talked about some. This also impinges on the digital currency space, Torsten mentioned. Probably central bank digital currencies are a good idea, if only to help push out the cryptocurrency sector, which in my view is a menace along many dimensions, but to leverage this to get a more efficient payment system internationally, which was the original idea of Libra, which is now called DM by Meta, which used to be called Facebook. We need very close central bank cooperation. And also on a fiscal level, because the issues are fundamentally fiscal issues. Fiscal cooperation on corporate tax, very important. International cooperation on limiting corruption is a huge agenda, and corruption is one of the most potent forces sapping democracy and feeding populism, the sense that everything is rigged in favor of the elites and those with resources. So there are huge challenges, and they can't be met unless the US and China get on the same page and realize that the threats they face from these issues outweigh their differences. I'm not sure exactly how that happens. One key issue is dialogue. I think the greatest threat, and this was underscored in a speech in London recently by the director of Britain's MI6, is just miscommunication, just that intentions are read incorrectly. And this was a frontline issue during the Cold War between the US and the Soviets. It's something that I think can be managed, but both sides have to realize how important it is. Now, unfortunately for international cooperation, I worry that the conditions are not good. And it's just not going to happen simply because the Biden administration declares that the United States is back. And that's because the United States isn't back. It just isn't back. I recently completed with some co-authors, one economist and two historians, a paper where which was written to sort of commemorate John Maynard Keynes's 1919 book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And we make the case that this part of the 21st century is much more like 1919 than like 1945, when the global community was much more successful in building some structures of international governance that to some degree have been pretty useful and pretty successful, and that provide venues, importantly, where countries with very different ideologies can speak to each other frankly and work together. And I saw this, in action at the IMF in meetings of its executive board. And one of the big differences is simply that in 1945, the US was the indisputable hegemonic power. And it knew that if it provided public goods which stabilized the world economy, it would internalize to a great degree those benefits in a number of ways, not the least was in its ability to export to the rest of the world. 1919 was a lot like now in more ways than I like to think about. Of course, Woodrow Wilson in the Versailles Treaty put forth this vision of the League of Nations. When he returned from Versailles, he returned to a United States in which Black people were being lynched in Washington, D.C., and in other American cities such as Chicago, just the beginning of a cycle of years of violence toward blacks, which included the Tulsa riot, and driven by transformation in the economy, industrial transformation, by the migration of blacks from the South to northern cities where suddenly industrial jobs were available, by seeing black soldiers in uniform, which enraged many segments of the population. There was also anti-immigrant sentiment, which led to very restrictive legislation in the 1920s in the next administration. The next administration also levied huge import tariffs, which made it impossible for allies in Europe to repay war debts. So, and of course, the US ended up not participating in the League, which crippled it from the start. So the world, after hearing Wilson speak, expected the US to be there in a position of leadership. He wasn't. Fast forward 102 years, Biden has declared America is back, but we're not living in a unipolar world. We have a united Europe. Perhaps more importantly, we have a rising and aggressive China. The US is riven by cultural and class conflicts that really look a lot like the ones that were present in 1919. And the environment is equally polarized. So, a year ago when Joe Biden won the election, the world eagerly anticipated that perhaps the US would revert to what they had thought to be a more normal pattern. Now they see there's a new normal. And the US's ability to make commitments is in question. Certainly some of the areas of cooperation I've talked about could be areas which could be messaged in a way that could build popular support within the US, but that's a process that really has to be pursued very aggressively. So, where do we go in the next few years in the ability of the world to solve these problems? It's kind of what Daron said. It's a very narrow corridor. It's a very narrow corridor. And it requires the US administration to do many good things domestically in an unfavorable environment. It requires a very skillful management of the relationship with China in a way that produces win-wins and that also diffuses some of the anti-China sentiment in the US. It's probably not going to be it will definitely not be easy. It is likely not to be a monotonic process. There may be reversals, there may be advances. I think at best we can hope that the advances are greater than the reversals. But, I'd have to say that we're in for a rough ride. And in the meantime, the problems of disease and climate cannot wait. There was also, by the way, in 1919, 1918, a worldwide pandemic, which led to the deaths of tens of millions. It was not effectively controlled, and many of the same tensions about masks, for example, arose then. The same cultural issues. So, it may be that before we get to another 1945 moment, we have to go through another interwar moment. I hope that is not the case, but it's something we should definitely factor in. The US, China, large countries like large regions, the EU worry about their sovereignty. The stakes for a country like Korea are very high because Korea's sovereignty is raised when these big powers can cooperate in a way that limits their unilateral actions. And so, you know, you folks here in Korea have a big stake in a successful outcome. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Now we could have a free discussion among the participants, but before doing it, I would like to ask you to comment on two questions on finance I raised in my email yesterday. One is regulation of cryptocurrency and crypto industry. Now, the cryptocurrency market, so market cap is about a little bit over 3 trillion, and the decentralized financial market size is very close to 250 billion. A year ago, the size was less than 600 million. So that the two markets, cryptocurrency markets and the decentralized financial markets, are growing very fast, although compared to the international financial markets or international banking, the size is very small, and they are totally outside of the regulatory regime. So my question is to Professor Asamoah, is it possible or is it desirable to regulate them out? And the second question is related to this, the alliance of 450 international financial institutions to raise something like 130 trillion, which is lots of money, to be dispersed over the next 30 years to finance industries they favor, and the industries which will reduce the carbon emissions. My question is, whose money they are going to spend, and who they are now capable of deciding which industry should receive their lending? These are the questions. After all, they have fiduciary duties. I mean, they may be using my own money or your money, and these are the questions that I am interested in. So, would you, Professor Asamoah, would you start first on this regulation issue?
I'll be happy to. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave at some point and go home to free the babysitter, but I'll have a little bit of time. So on the cryptocurrencies, I completely endorse everything that Maury said. I think cryptocurrencies are quite dangerous. I worry about various problems they're creating, and I think they need to be regulated, but it's actually not clear how they can be regulated at the moment. And I think they are going to have a variety of negative consequences, and they already are. And I'm not optimistic that central banks having digital currencies is going to deal with the cryptocurrency issues. So I think a different approach is necessary. But let me talk a little bit more about your second point. I think a lot of economists subscribe to what is sometimes called the Tinbergen principle, which is, you have policies that are narrowly targeted to specific distortions. And I think that's a good economic framework for normal times and when there aren't systemic failures of markets. I think when it comes to climate, both of these conditions are violated. So we are not in normal times. This is really an existential crisis. And there are systemic failures. It's failures in innovation, failures in the pricing of carbon, failures in all the externalities that are created by various different types of sectors, from agriculture to transport to manufacturing to home sectors. So I think we need to abandon the Tinbergen principle and use many instruments. So in that sense, I actually welcome very much the efforts that are being led by Mark Carney, for example, to bring climate issues on the agenda of central banks. So I think we should all be happy if indeed financial institutions and government agencies were using all of our money for clean energy. Unfortunately, I think these pledges that you're talking about, that those actually don't go very far. First of all, a lot of the big energy companies are positioning themselves to be recipients of both subsidies and finance for many of the green technologies. If you look at there was a huge number of new patents early on in green technology. Not many of them came from big energy, but now big energy is trying to dominate that space. And my fear would be that a lot of the money that's been pledged will actually go back and be captured by existing traditional energy companies, and money is fungible, so it's not clear what it's going to be used. And I have zero confidence that BP or ExxonMobil or Chevron are really committed to combating climate change or reduce emissions. So I think something much more systematic is needed. As Suresh raised and you emphasized, Dr. Park, we cannot trust government's capability to regulate very much. There are a lot of weaknesses, state capacity issues, capture issues, but I certainly would trust financial institutions much less in deciding where really clean dollars should go, or where dollars should go for clean energy. So I think a much more robust framework for government-led regulation is necessary for channeling money into clean technology, and all of that, of course, needs to be complemented by a global carbon tax that probably needs to be much, much higher than anything we've seen right now. Right now we have the Sweden's tax is the highest, around $120, I think, right now with the exchange rate. Even that is by per metric ton, and even that is probably too low, especially when you take into account other implicit subsidies that carbon emitters are receiving.
Maybe I can come in very briefly here, and I'm afraid I have to also log off in a couple of minutes. It's getting quite late here. So, but I want to kind of comment on these two questions. So first, on the cryptocurrencies, I also agree that this is, this is I would call it tulip mania of the 21st century. It's just not, the initial idea is interesting. And yes, you can, of course, construct a theoretical model which tells you, yes, if one of these currencies is going to be suddenly accepted as money, then it actually has a value. But as long as that doesn't happen, the value is, I would say, effectively zero. So I'm very critical, not to speak about the environmental costs. So this is, and I don't quite see how this actually, as we discussed, Professor Parker, how this should be linked with the financial system. I'm a bit more skeptical than Professor Obstfeld about these digital central bank issued digital currencies, because it depends a bit how you structure it. But if it's some kind of almost like a substitute for cash, or a substitute for cash-like or money-like bank deposits, so if banks kind of lose their privilege of private money creation, you could argue, yeah, maybe it's about time, but it will certainly lead to disruption. And there might be certain transition risks, and then I think we have to carefully think about whether it's worthwhile going that. So I'm just saying that there is a kind of a cost-benefit analysis to be had. On the Tinbergen principle, I want to push back a little bit, Darren. Sorry, but I guess it depends on how you interpret that, and you probably know it much better than I do. I always think about the Tinbergen principle much more about specific tools. So take capital requirements, for example. It doesn't make sense to have a green discount or a brown factor, a premium for capital regulations or not. And there you kind of mix two things, the prudential and then the environmental goal. Where I would completely agree is that central banks cannot ignore climate change. Absolutely not. We had this discussion, we're having this discussion here with the ECB in Europe about whether their asset purchases should also reflect a certain green bias. And actually, it's completely in line with the mandate of the ECB, which is to support the general policies, economic policies of the European Union, which includes climate change. So I think, and similarly, so that's discussed. I would certainly perfectly agree with you on when it comes to prudential regulation. Yeah, the question is, if it's purely prudential, absolutely. There is an environmental risk, which leads then, of course, to performance risk of these assets. There's a regulatory risk, which can make some of these assets stranded assets, and all of this the prudential authority has to take into account. Is there an additional element, or should it be left to somebody else in terms of taking into account these environmental externalities? Yes, so that's then again a discussion to be had whether it should be the same authority that kind of takes into account these externalities or not. In general, I would say, as you also said, Darren, I think the carbon, there are much more powerful tools that have to be applied in order to get where we want to go in terms of the transition to net zero. And maybe as a final point, and also kind of, and I know that you kind of asked this question in a provocative way, Professor Park, if I understand correctly, but I see it also more as kind of a maybe an ambition, and I'm not sure whether it's something. I wouldn't call it marketing maybe, but it kind of goes a little bit this way. But I think it is important to see that beyond political, regulatory, central bank pressure, I think the general stakeholder pressure on banks, on the financial markets to kind of support the green transition, I think is an important one. So if in this context, this global alliance can play a role, by all means.
All right.
Do we take all of it seriously? Probably not.
Okay.
Do we still need prudential restrictions on that? By all means.
Okay. Murray, you have to leave soon. So any comments, final comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, fortunately, there's little left to be said because I agree strongly with what Daron and Torsten have said. On cryptos, my gut is yes, it's tulip mania, and it's hard to think of any regulatory acts other than shutting them down that would not undermine the fundamental business model, which is based on absolute secrecy. And so, otherwise, you could think of them as a harmless casino, but I think they're much worse than a harmless casino. On the climate stuff, 130 trillion, admittedly, it's over 30 years, but it's significantly more than a year's global GDP. So it's a lot of money. But it's just not clear how it gets allocated efficiently and that there will be follow through. To my mind, it's a critical issue because, salvation is going to come from the development of green technologies that are more economical than fossil fuels, right? You want to, the only reason why whales are swimming around in the ocean is because we developed electricity and it was cheaper than going out and killing whales and boiling them down for their fat and turning them into candles. And so we have whales. So we want this stuff to stay in the ground, and we therefore need cheaper technologies. One area that is quite urgent, though, is that developing countries, particularly in Africa, have huge infrastructure needs given their growing populations. And if those are met on the basis of fossil fuel intensive technologies, we're really in trouble. So I think the global community has a great common interest in making resources available with some conditionality to promote cleaner alternatives in these new infrastructure projects. And this is a point Nick Stern has made very eloquently. Otherwise, we're definitely not going to make it.
Thank you. Chung-Hwa, would you make a final comment? Very short one, because they have to leave. All three of them will have to leave. And the President Park told me this morning that more than 9 million people in this country own crypto assets, and there is a strong pressure to legalize these currencies and assets. And this is going to be a serious political and the economic problems in this country. So I appreciate very much your comments on the current issue, and I'm very happy to hear that you all agree with me, at least. They have to be regulated out. Thank you very much. But Chung-Hwa.
Well, just 1 minute, and I do not have any cryptocurrency, so I completely agree with all of your opinions that we should regulate it. And I don't know. The question is how we could really effectively regulate it? I mean, that's the big question. I think it's current discussion today's in the panel actually pointed out a lot of important issues. So I learned a lot, and thank you very much for sharing your insight. Especially, Aaron mentioned this interrelations between the cheap monetary policy and political development. I think that's the very interesting observations, and that clearly have implications to the Korea's political development. And I hope, I mean, we can have another chance to discuss this issue. I mean, this is also relevant. I'm pretty much sure, as you emphasized, had a lot of implication to the other countries, not just in Korea. And another discussion, Mori mentioned this analysis between the 1919 and current situation, rather than between 1945 and now. So this is a very interesting observations, and he really emphasized a couple of risks for the Korean economy, this fiscal risk, as well as these spillovers from the U.S.-China conflict. I think this is really gives a lot of challenge to the Korean economy. I really appreciate it for your comment. And these financial issues are very much important, and I'm not sure this is my job, but thank you for KIF for organizing this very important conference.
Thank you very much. I was a very lousy coordinator, but I really enjoyed, and especially I appreciate your inspiring discussion and comments. And thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you to KIF for organizing it. It's great to be part of it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
This concludes the International Conference for the 30th anniversary of the KIF. Thank you very much.